I wish I'd found my voice sooner, but regret, my late husband used to say, is just wisdom arriving at the wrong address. I'm 63 years old, and I've spent the last 4 years since Gerald passed trying to figure out where a widow fits in a world that keeps moving faster than she can follow. My name is Eleanor Beaumont, and until last month, I thought my best days were behind me. I thought being quiet was the same as being gracious. I thought shrinking myself was a kindness to everyone around me. I was wrong about all of it. Gerald and I built our life in Oakville, just outside Toronto, in a red brick house with a garden that flooded every April and a kitchen that always smelled like coffee. He was an engineer with the city, a man who could fix anything except a broken heart, which his own turned out to be 4 years ago on a Tuesday morning in February. One minute he was reading the Globe and Mail at the kitchen table, complaining about the price of bacon, and the next he was gone. 31 years of marriage ended between one sip of coffee and the next. Our son Thomas was 36 when his father died. He'd already moved into Toronto proper, taken a senior role at one of the big consulting firms on Bay Street, the kind of job where people measured their lives in billable hours and quarterly bonuses. He came home for the funeral, held my hand through the service at St. Jude's Anglican, and then disappeared back into his work the way some men disappear into a bottle. I didn't blame him. We all grieve in whatever language we speak best. And Thomas had always spoken in spreadsheets and deadlines. 3 years ago, Thomas married a young woman named Priya Joshi. She was extraordinary, truly. A pediatric surgeon at Sick Kids, the kind of person who saved children's lives on Tuesday and spoke at medical conferences on Wednesday. Her parents had immigrated from Gujarat back in the 1980s, started a small grocery in Brampton, and grown it into a chain of 5 stores across the GTA. They were warm, loud, generous people who filled every room they entered. And I, somehow, kept finding myself in the corners of those rooms. Priya wasn't unkind to me. That's the thing that made it so difficult to explain, even to myself. She'd ask after my health with that polite distance doctors use with patients they barely remember. She'd compliment my garden when she came by, which wasn't often. Her pager would go off, or Thomas's phone would ring, and the visit that was meant to last an afternoon would end in 20 minutes. I'd wave from my porch as their Tesla pulled out of my driveway, and then I'd go inside and wash 2 teacups and feel the silence settle back into the house like dust. I told myself this was just how it worked now. Young professionals in Toronto didn't have time to sit with their widowed mothers. I volunteered at the Oakville Public Library on Wednesdays. I took a pottery class at the Sheridan Community Center. I had friends from my years teaching at Appleby College, though most of them had retired south to Florida or west to Vancouver Island. I had enough. I kept telling myself I had enough. The call came on a Thursday in late October, when the maples along my street had turned the color of copper pennies. I was pruning the roses when my phone rang, and I saw Thomas's name on the screen, which startled me because he usually texted, and only when he needed something. "Mum, hi, how are you?" His voice had that compressed quality I recognized from Gerald's working years, the sound of a man trying to have a conversation while reading emails. "I'm well, darling. Everything all right?" Yeah, everything's fine. Listen, I wanted to ask you something. Priya's parents are hosting a dinner this Saturday night. It's actually a big deal. There's a delegation coming in from Mumbai. Textile importers. Family-owned business. 3 generations. The Hauz. They're looking at a major Canadian partnership, and Priya's father introduced them to our firm. I waited. I knew there was more. Anyway, Anita and Raj, you remember them, they're hosting at their place in Mississauga, and Priya thought, well, we thought it would be nice if you came too. Show a united family. The Hauz are apparently very traditional. Family is a big part of how they do business. I set down my pruning shears. You'd like me there to help close a deal. That's not, Mum. That's not what I'm saying. We just thought, it's been a while. You haven't seen Priya's parents since the wedding, really. It would be nice. I should have said no. I had my reasons, plenty of them. But underneath every reason was a truth I didn't want to admit. I was starving for the sound of my son's voice at my kitchen table, and I would take whatever version of that I could get, even if it came wrapped in a business proposition. What time? 7. And Mum, wear something nice. Not fancy, just, nice. After he hung up, I stood in my kitchen staring at the calendar on my fridge, covered in doctor's appointments and library shifts, and one circled anniversary I couldn't bring myself to uncircle. I thought about what Thomas didn't know about me. I thought about what I'd never told him, because the moment had never seemed right, and then the moment had passed entirely. He didn't know about Delhi. Before I married Gerald, before I became Mrs. Beaumont of Oakville, I was Eleanor Hartley, 24 years old, fresh out of McGill, with a degree in comparative literature and a head full of poets. My parents had expected me to teach high school in Montreal and marry someone suitable. Instead, I saw an advertisement in the newspaper for English language teachers at a private school in New Delhi, and I wrote the letter that changed my life before I'd even finished my morning coffee. I went for a 2-year contract. I stayed for 9 years. I taught at a school in Defense Colony and lived in a small flat in Hauz Khas, back when Hauz Khas was still mostly families and vegetable vendors and stray dogs who knew your schedule better than you did. I learned Hindi from my landlady, Mrs. Malhotra, who corrected my grammar while she braided her granddaughter's hair. I learned it from the auto-rickshaw drivers who laughed at my accent and the booksellers in Khan Market who sold me battered copies of Premchand and Ismat Chutai. I learned it not from textbooks but from life, which is the only way you really learn a language. I dreamed in Hindi. I argued with shopkeepers in Hindi. I wrote letters home to my mother in English but thought in 2 languages, and sometimes the English sentence would arrive already translated from a Hindi original I couldn't quite remember forming. I met Gerald in my 9th year. He was in Delhi for a water infrastructure project his company was consulting on. A Canadian boy from Thunder Bay who'd never been further east than Halifax until that trip. We met at a mutual friend's Diwali party. He was holding a plate of food he couldn't identify and looking at it with such genuine bewilderment that I took pity on him and walked him through every item on his plate. We were engaged within 4 months and married in Toronto the following autumn. I packed up my flat in Hauz Khas, said goodbye to Mrs. Malhotra, and flew home to become a wife and, eventually, a mother. I meant to teach Thomas Hindi when he was little. I started with a few words. Pani for water, dud for milk. But suburban Oakville in the 1990s had no use for Hindi, and Thomas was a practical child even at 5, and eventually I stopped. I kept reading Hindi novels in the attic when he was at school. I watched old Hindi films on public television when Gerald was working late. But that whole decade of my life became something private, a room in my own house I stopped inviting people into, and eventually I almost forgot the room was there. Thomas knew I'd traveled when I was young. That's how I'd always phrased it. I traveled for a few years after university. He'd never asked for specifics, and I'd never volunteered them. It felt, somehow, like bragging about a life that belonged to someone else, like showing the photographs of a stranger. Saturday came faster than I wanted. I stood in front of my closet for an hour. I finally chose an emerald silk blouse Gerald had bought me years ago, and a pair of gray wool trousers. Simple, not trying. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror and tried to see what Priya's mother Anita would see when I walked in. A widow, a mother-in-law, someone polite and quiet, and ultimately forgettable. I touched my hair, picked up my purse, and drove the 40 minutes from Oakville to Mississauga with the radio off and my stomach in knots. The Joshi house was large and warm and smelled, from the front walk, like cardamom and fried onions and something roasting with cloves. Anita opened the door in a sari the color of deep plum, her smile wide and her eyes assessing. "Eleanor, you came. So lovely. Come, everyone is already here." She embraced me the way she always did, both arms but no pressure, the kind of hug you give an acquaintance at a funeral. The foyer was full of shoes lined up neatly, so I bent to remove mine, and from the living room I could hear voices, a rising and falling of conversation in at least 3 languages. I caught the rhythm of Hindi before I even walked in. My heart did something complicated, something I hadn't felt in decades, like a dog hearing its own name from a very long distance. "Ma, Eleanor's here," Anita called as we entered, and heads turned. Thomas was there, rising from the sofa with his practiced smile. Priya beside him in a sari of midnight blue, looking like she'd been born to wear it. Raj, Priya's father, big and warm with a laugh that started in his belly, and 3 men I didn't recognize, seated on the longer sofa, 2 older and 1 young. "Mum," Thomas kissed my cheek. "You made it. You look great. Let me introduce you." He walked me across the room. "Mr. Shah, this is my mother, Eleanor Beaumont, "Mum, this is Vikram Shah, his elder brother Suresh Shah, and Suresh's son, Aditya." The older brother, Suresh, was perhaps 70, silver-haired and formally dressed in a charcoal suit. He rose and gave me a small bow. "Namaste," he said. "A pleasure to meet you," I replied in English, smiling politely, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain everyone could hear it. Vikram was younger, maybe my age, with kind eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. Aditya looked about Thomas's age, polished and watchful, clearly the heir being groomed. They all shook my hand with that slight reserve you see in people raised to respect elders, and then I was guided to a chair slightly apart from the main conversation circle, near a side table with a bowl of cashews I didn't feel like eating. Anita brought me a glass of white wine. Priya smiled at me from across the room and then returned to her conversation with Suresh. I sat with my wine and watched the evening begin without me. The conversation moved between English and Hindi, and occasionally Gujarati, which I'd never learned well. The Shahs spoke mostly in Hindi among themselves, and switched to polite English when addressing Thomas or the room at large. Raj played the genial host, Anita played the perfect hostess, Priya translated seamlessly between worlds, and I sat in the corner holding a wine glass and listening. "Thomas, your firm's credentials are impressive," Suresh said in his careful English. "But in Mumbai, we do business with families, not companies. We need to know the character behind the contract. The Shahs have been in textiles for 78 years, 3 generations. Every partnership we make with the grandchildren in mind. Family is everything to us as well," Thomas said warmly. Anita beamed. "Oh, absolutely. Family is everything. Raj and we built our stores for Priya and her brother. Everything we do is for family." Priya glanced at me then, quickly, and then looked away. I watched her say something to her mother in Hindi. A small thing, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who has no idea her mother-in-law speaks the same language. "Mama, please try to make her feel welcome," Anita replied in Hindi, keeping her voice low, her smile fixed on Suresh. "I am trying, Beta. But you know how she is. So cold, so quiet. These English-Canadian women, they do not know how to sit with family. They always look like they are somewhere else." I kept my face perfectly still. I took a sip of wine. My hand did not shake, though every part of me wanted it to. Suresh noticed the exchange. He was too polite to ask, but I watched him register it. Raj joined the conversation in Hindi, his voice low and warm. "She is a widow, Anita. Be kind." "I am kind. But look at her. She has not said one real thing all evening. Priya says she has not visited her grandchildren. I mean, she has not even shown interest in them having children. She sits in that big house in Oakville alone. It is not natural." My chest tightened. I did have a relationship with Priya that I wanted. I did want to know her. I had wanted for 3 years to be invited into their lives in any way that was not a formal holiday dinner. I had waited for an invitation that never came, and I had told myself waiting gracefully was the right thing to do. Suresh said, in Hindi, quietly to his brother Vikram, "I am concerned. In our culture, a man's treatment of his mother tells you everything. If Thomas cannot bring his widowed mother closer into his home, what kind of partner will he be for us? A business deal is a long marriage." Vikram nodded slowly. "I see it too, brother. The coldness in this house between the mothers. It is not a good sign. Perhaps we should reconsider." My pulse roared in my ears. I looked across the room at Thomas, oblivious, laughing at something Aditya had said about Toronto traffic. I looked at Priya, my beautiful, brilliant daughter-in-law, who had apparently been describing me to her mother as cold and absent for 3 years. And I realized with a cracking clarity that she genuinely believed it. She wasn't lying to her family. She was telling them what she thought was true, because I had never corrected the story. I had let her write it, and then I had lived in it. Anita called us to the dining table. The spread was magnificent. Platters of dal makhani and bindi masala and freshly rolled rotis still warm from the pan, a biryani that made the whole room smell like Delhi in October. I sat where I was placed, at the end of the table near Raj, while the Shahs and Thomas and Priya clustered at the other end, and the real conversation continued in a language the hosts believed no one else at the table could understand. I ate slowly. I tasted nothing. Raj tried to include me with small questions about my garden, and I answered in the polite, deflecting way I had perfected over the last 4 years. Yes. The roses had been lovely this year. Yes. Oakville was pleasant in autumn. Yes, thank you, I was quite well. Halfway through the main course, Anita leaned toward Suresh and said, in Hindi, with a small sympathetic smile aimed at me, Suresh ji, I apologize for the awkwardness. Priya does her best. But this is what happens in some of these older Canadian families. No warmth, no closeness. Thomas is a good boy, but he grew up in a cold house. You can see it in his mother. I set down my fork, very carefully. I took a long breath in and a slow breath out, the way Mrs. Malhotra had taught me to do in Hindi decades ago, when I was overwhelmed by Delhi traffic and homesickness, and the simple impossibility of being young and far from home. And then, in the Hindi I had not spoken aloud in 29 years, in the accent of Hauz Khas in the 1980s, I looked down the table at Anita and said, Maaf kiya, Anita. Mujhe lagta hai aap kuch galat samajh rahi hain. Forgive me, Anita. I think you are misunderstanding something. The silence was immediate and absolute. Anita's fork clattered softly against her plate. Raj's eyes went wide. Priya's face drained of color. Thomas looked at me as though I had just stood up on the table and started singing opera. But Suresh broke into the most genuine smile I had seen all evening, and his brother Vikram began, very quietly, to laugh. I continued in Hindi, my voice steadier than I felt. I apologize for my silence earlier. I have understood every word this evening. I felt I should correct some impressions before they caused any more harm. You speak Hindi, Anita whispered. Her face had gone an alarming shade. I lived in Delhi for 9 years when I was young. I taught at a school in Defense Colony. I had a flat in Hauz Khas, above a tailor's shop. I learned the language not from a book, but from a woman named Mrs. Malhotra who believed no student of hers would embarrass her in the market. I turned to Suresh and Vikram. Gentlemen, forgive me for listening without declaring myself. I did not plan it. I was simply overwhelmed to hear the language again after so many years, and by the time I should have spoken, the moment had passed. But I cannot sit quietly while my son's character is judged on false information. Whatever distance you have observed between my family and me, it is not my son's failing. It is mine. Suresh had set down his utensils. He was looking at me as though seeing me for the first time, which, in a sense, he was. When my husband died 4 years ago, I said, I made a choice. I chose not to cling to my son. I told myself he had his own life, his own marriage, his own career, and that the loving thing was to make myself small and easy to ignore. I gave him space he had not asked for. I waited for invitations I had decided, in my own mind, not to request. I let my silence be interpreted as preference. I let my absence be interpreted as indifference. I looked at Priya. Her eyes were wet. Priya, I have never been cold to you. I have been afraid. I have been lonely, and I have been afraid that if I reached out you would feel obligated, and I could not bear the thought of being an obligation. So I waited. I waited for a door to open, and I never knocked on one. That is not your failure. That is mine. Anita had tears streaming down her face. Eleanor, I am so sorry. You were protecting your daughter? I said gently. I understand. A mother defends her child. You were telling the truth as you understood it. I turned back to the Shahs. Sureshji, Vikramji, please do not reject my son's firm because of your observations tonight. Thomas is not a cold man. He is a grieving son who lost his father suddenly, and who has been working 16-hour days for 4 years because work is how he holds himself together. He did not abandon me. He was waiting for me to tell him I needed him, and I never did, because I was too proud to admit I was drowning. Thomas was crying openly now. I had not seen him cry since Gerald's funeral. Mum, he said. Let me finish, darling. I took another breath. Family is complicated in every culture. We love each other and we fail each other. We make assumptions and we build walls out of those assumptions, and we call the walls dignity. I built a wall around myself after my husband died. I called it independence. I called it not being a burden. But it was a wall. And behind it I have been very, very lonely. Tonight, for the first time in years, I am tearing it down. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of a room listening. Suresh began, slowly, to clap. Just 3 times. Very softly. Mrs. Beaumont, he said, in English now for Thomas's benefit. I have been in business for 51 years. I have learned that the most important conversations at any dinner happen in the languages people assume no one else understands. I learned this when I was young and foolish, and it has served me well. Tonight I am reminded of it again. He looked at Thomas. Your mother is a remarkable woman. What she has just done takes more courage than any negotiation I have ever conducted. You are fortunate. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. Vikram spoke up then in Hindi, addressing only me. Mrs. Beaumont, may I ask, which school did you teach at in Defense Colony? I told him. His face opened into delight. My cousin's daughter attended that school. She is 41 now. She still speaks about an English teacher, a Canadian woman, who made her love poetry. Tall woman, she said with sad eyes and a kind laugh. Mrs. Hartley. My vision blurred. That was my name before I married, Eleanor Hartley. My God. Vikram shook his head slowly, smiling. My God, what a small world we live in. The rest of the dinner was transformed. Anita got up, came around the table, and sat next to me. She held my hand through the entire dessert course, a gulab jamun I could barely taste through the tears I kept blinking back. Raj poured me a glass of brandy and demanded I tell him about Hauz Khas in the 80s, which he remembered from his own youth in Ahmedabad. Priya, across the table, kept meeting my eyes and looking away, and I knew we had years of conversation ahead of us, only years of rebuilding what I had let collapse. Thomas sat beside me. He held my hand under the table like a child. Every few minutes he would squeeze it, as if making sure I was still there. Near the end of the evening, Suresh leaned forward and addressed me directly. Mrs. Beaumont, I have a proposal for you. It is separate from the business we are discussing with your son, and please feel no obligation. I waited. Our company is expanding into the Canadian market. We need more than contracts. We need cultural advisors, people who understand both worlds. You speak Hindi fluently, you lived in India, you understand Canadian business culture, and you have, forgive me, the kind of dignity that opens doors in both countries. We would like to hire you as a consultant. Flexible hours. Travel to Mumbai when you wish, never when you do not. Generous compensation. And the respect of a family business that does not forget who helped build it. I stared at him. I am 63 years old, Suresh ji. I am 72. Vikram is 64. Aditya is the only young person in this conversation, and he mostly listens. Suresh smiled. We do not measure people by years, Mrs. Beaumont. We measure them by what they carry. You carry more than most. I looked at Thomas. He was grinning through his tears, nodding at me so hard I thought his head might come off. I will think about it, I said. But the truth was already in my throat. The truth was a flight to Delhi I had not allowed myself to imagine for 30 years. The truth was a version of myself I had buried, and she was climbing out of the grave, and she was furious with me for ever putting her there. We said our goodbyes at nearly 11. Anita held me at the door and whispered, in Hindi, Eleanor, come for lunch on Sunday, just the two of us, please. I said yes, in Hindi, and her face crumpled again. Thomas walked me to my car. The October wind had turned cold, and the Mississauga sky was dark except for the haze of the city. He leaned against the driver's door so I could not open it. Mum, I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything yet. Say it on Sunday, or next Sunday, or the one after that. We have time. I haven't been a good son. You have been a grieving son. There is a difference. And I have not been a mother who let herself be mothered. I built you a wall, and then complained that you did not climb it. I am sorry, Thomas. I am so sorry I made myself so hard to reach. He pulled me into his arms, and my son, my grown son, my 40-year-old son in his expensive coat, cried into my shoulder the way he had cried when he was 6 and had broken his arm falling out of the maple tree in our backyard. I held him and I felt something reopen in me that I had sealed shut the morning his father died. When I finally drove home through the quiet streets of the QEW, my phone kept buzzing. Text from Thomas, I love you, Mum. Text from Priya, her first ever that wasn't about scheduling. Eleanor, I am so ashamed, and I want to do better, and I want to know you. Text from Anita, lunch at 1 on Sunday. Bring your appetite. Text from a number I did not recognize, which turned out to be Suresh. Mrs. Beaumont, our offer stands. We fly back to Mumbai in 3 weeks. There is a seat on that flight for you, if you would like to see Delhi again. No pressure, only an invitation. I sat in my driveway in Oakville with the engine off and the October stars barely visible through the streetlights, and I realized I had been waiting for this phone to buzz for 4 years. I typed back to Suresh, I would very much like to see Delhi again. Let us discuss the details. His reply came within seconds. Wonderful. The Delhi you knew is gone, but the city is still there, and it has been waiting for you. I went inside my red brick house and stood in the kitchen where Gerald had died. I put the kettle on. I made a cup of tea I did not drink. I looked around at the life I had built out of smallness, out of not wanting to bother anyone, out of apologizing for occupying the space I had every right to occupy. I thought I had lost my voice when I lost Gerald. I thought widowhood was a kind of quiet I was supposed to accept with grace. I thought being a good mother-in-law meant being a ghost in someone else's house. I was wrong about everything. The secret was never that I spoke Hindi. The secret was that I had stopped speaking at all, in any language, about what I actually wanted. I had stopped asking to be included because I was afraid of the answer. I had stopped taking up space because I thought taking up space was selfish. I had confused self-erasure with dignity, and I had spent 4 years disappearing in my own life. I did not need anyone's permission to be a whole person again. I never had. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom that night, and I opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, where for 29 years I had kept a small cedar box. Inside were letters from Mrs. Malhotra, a pressed marigold from a Diwali in 1983, a photograph of me at 28, on the roof of my Hauz Khas flat with Delhi spreading out behind me like a second sky. I had not opened this box in a decade. I sat on the edge of my bed and held the photograph and looked at that young woman's face. She was so fierce, so unafraid. She had crossed an ocean for a job. She had learned a new language from the women at the vegetable stall. She had laughed in 3 languages and loved in 2, and not once apologized for any of it. She was still in me. She had been waiting this whole time. She had been waiting for me to stop telling her she was a dream I had once had, and to start telling her she was a life I was still living. I pressed the photograph to my chest, and I spoke to her in Hindi softly, the way you speak to someone you have missed terribly. Main wapas aa rahi hun. I am coming back. Outside my window, the last of the October leaves were falling in the streetlight. Inside, in a house that had been too quiet for 4 years, an old woman began finally to take up space. And the best part of my life, I understood then, had not happened yet.